So this paper that I'm going to be presenting today is a bit of an experiment, and it's I was very glad to receive the invitation to speak about institutions, because the psychoanalytic institution is one that I've been thinking about for a long time. So it's enabled me to be able to wrap logic or some sort of thought around my critique of the psychoanalytic institution. So thank you, Urosh, for this invitation, and thank you to Litsa for mediating it for me. So the title of my paper is Psychoanalysis, Slip of the Discourse. We might say that Freud's 1926 pamphlet, The Question of Lay Analysis, Conversations with an Impartial Person, might well be his testimony, his transmission of a movement which speaks directly to both harnessing and giving grounds to one's desire in occupying a different subject position of knowledge. The event which led Freud to writing this pamphlet was when advocating for his analysand Theodor Reich, a prominent non-medical member of the psychoanalytic community, to train as an analyst. The quackery laws of Vienna of the time prevented this from taking place, because then only the medical fraternity could train in psychoanalysis. There is a sense of urgency underlying Freud's pamphlet, written in June 1926, immediately printed in July and formally published in September. This pamphlet was, however, a successful intervention, and the then legal proceedings against Reich were stopped. What followed, and of relevance to this day, is the question of how psychoanalysis can be legitimized as a field of knowledge which is situated within the institution, yet expansive beyond it. Freud was committed to the experimental nature of his theory, and that it be thought of as occupying a space within yet beyond the institution. However, he was well aware that legitimization was first required within the authority of medical discourse, and so Freud was not standing entirely in opposition to the medical establishment, but rather critiquing it when serving as an institutional authority for the psychoanalytic cure. This institutional medical framework initially at least provided a legitimized pathway and even minimal freedom to pursue psychoanalysis, which all along Freud knew required obedience to a regulation beyond medical authority. Although he attempted to tread carefully, and sometimes not so carefully, within the medical institution, Freud maintained a vision that psychoanalysis could be both self-sufficient and inclusive of other fields, such as anthropology and literature. This expansiveness seemed to Freud a sufficient regulation for his theory, and he thus induced a structural break in the medical establishment by operating within its institutional power to produce something else. Thus, psychoanalysis, which was not medicine, but institutionally produced within it, moved away from the protection of medical discourse into another position, which allowed a different authorization independent of it. Freud saw this as essential for him. Psychoanalysis focused on the question of how the unconscious could be addressed and how unconscious forces manifest and produce symptoms. He thought that attending to symptoms which could not be altogether biologically located meant that psychoanalysis fell outside the medical institution of the time. Freud's radical idea that the unconscious is the cause of one's symptoms rattled the medical fraternity, because in introducing the question of the cause, the Freudian neurotic symptom, Freud was explicitly questioning the very institution which had set up how symptoms should be thought of and treated. Moreover, his singular curiosity about the symptom and its relationship to the unconscious implied a critique of those who exercised power in the existing medical establishment, the very body which wrote and instituted the law so power could materialize and be maintained. This is classical politics. We are in the domain of power, including personal will to power within the confines of the institution. For Freud, the medical institution was insufficient to accommodate curiosity about the unconscious, because within the unconscious, power is not a concept. This is not to dismiss or diminish the effects of power. Indeed, it is the unconscious which is the very power behind subjectivity. However, to invoke the medical institution here is to introduce a third term, somewhat superfluous to the practice of psychoanalysis. Thus, Freud inevitably concluded that the medical model was ill-equipped to be knowledge master in the domain of psychoanalysis, which should instead be left to form on its own terms, its own institution. We might well conclude that Freud realized early on that the problem of the master and his law is at the same time a regulation in the use of those signifiers of knowledge. Articulating this in various ways, Freud maintained that psychoanalysis was not directed towards finding another truth, such as how to live a good life, but rather towards living more or less within what Lacan later calls the symptom produced during analysis. In psychoanalysis, therefore, truth is always already present. And in order to attain and comprehend it, one needs to attend to what is being said within and beyond theoretical and clinical analysis. For both the master and the analyst, the symptom is signified in particular ways which regulate how it is understood and thus treated. The aim for the master being a move towards mastery, and for the analyst towards a discourse of handling jouissance emanating from the unconscious. This is not to say that those in the field of psychoanalysis praxis are not at the same time undertaking a version of the master's discourse. We don't have to look too far to identify those who, in reading Freud and Lacan, purport a mastery of their knowledge and appropriate it to regulate their own ideological or political aspirations. Certainly, there are self-appointed masters around who enjoy attempting to regulate what constitutes psychoanalysis, thinking, and praxis today. But this is no different to those Freud and Lacan were critiquing. That regulating one's jouissance around the signifier psychoanalysis was a matter far removed for the question of the desire for or of psychoanalysis. Arguably today, nothing much comes out of such idiosyncratic regulation beyond simply invoking an institutional master who regulates how one might constitute a legitimate method for thinking and practicing the subject or object of psychoanalysis. Importantly, Lacan instituted the past specifically to address the problem with self-authorization post-Freud. At the time, self-authorization was plagued with charlatans, cheats, and con people, unlike today, which alarmed Lacan because those who are serious and committed know that such people and their institutions were ill-equipped to address questions of desire, jouissance, or how the unconscious creates symptoms. In an attempt to weed out the wheat from the chaff, Lacan instituted the past to his school of psychoanalysis, which he envisaged supported the discourse of the analyst. The procedure of the past is constituted by the testimony of the passant before two passeurs and accounts for the movement from the experience of analysand to analyst in training and finally to analyst proper. Central to this process is that one has undergone personal transferential analysis to arrive at a different desire, that of being an analyst. Training occurs at the school, and when analysands feel ready, after some considerable time of intensive supervision, writing, attending seminars, and the continuation of their interminable analysis, the trainee analyst experiences a movement in the form of a desire to be recognized by their peers as an analyst, thereby enabling them to participate formally in the supervision of other trainee analysts. To facilitate this desire, Lacan instituted the pass as a way of first recognizing that such a desire exists, and second, of bypassing the bureaucracy instituted by the IPA at the time. Although the pass is still practiced today, Lacan ended up feeling ambivalent about it, saying that perhaps a school should not come to expect it. And this is because, in the first place, one's position regarding knowledge changes during analysis. And while the past is testimony to this movement, it is nevertheless a change which has already happened before the testimony is given to the passeur. In other words, it happened or not, regardless of the evidence or testimony offered, and thus the procedure of the past wittingly reduces such a movement to logical time. Historicization not being characterized of the unconscious. Secondly, testimony of a change in one's desire is in any case irrelevant to the act of passing through, and is therefore no more than a symbolic act supported by a vague and somewhat incoherent social bond. Whoever takes up the desire to be an analyst, and not everyone does, accepts transforming into a different desire, a movement which the past attempts to portray in terms of institutional regulation. Coming to terms with this as purely theoretical exercise and understanding that the past does not specifically signify the movement, Lacan became increasingly critical of his own invention. Yet for him, psychoanalysis remained a viable and disciplined practice in which transformation did not require a relationship to the master because of its potential to be wholly resonant and speak for itself. We can say that Lacan was always trying to deinstitutionalize his own institution. The past is a problematic concept for psychoanalysis because it presents as a conflict between the ideal that in the absence of a master, a psychoanalytic institution can support and assist in institutional authorization for one to practice psychoanalysis. That is, one is bestowed the predicating qualities of a proper name. Not all passes pass muster for many reasons. The most obvious being that as soon as desire is spoken, it contends with the limitations of language because it enters the phallic order. However, at least in theory, the past attempts to recall something of the analysand or analyst in training, who has undergone the loss of the objet and experienced resultant destitution, a process in which one is forced to make something out of nothing before them. Amidst this chaos, desire lingers as a desire to test out one's handling of their symptom through saying something definitive. Lacan maintained that Freud's saying, although Freud never said this, was that there was no such thing as a sexual relationship. Lacan's saying is that the unconscious is structured like a language. These statements are their passing testimonies, left to linger, but nevertheless distinctive for their substantive qualities in expressing the unexpressible. Moreover, they can even be said at all rests upon a break with institutional structure, whilst upholding the psychoanalytic method needed for the contingent speech act. It seems that all the passant really needs to say in order to qualify for their pass is one simple sentence. Here the word becomes the act, and the only response is to name the subject and then to stay silent. The pass presented in this logic is a judgment of how, via the act thought, one must fully identify with a position. At the same time, Freud and Lacan were, through their interventions, allowing people to self-authorize and thereby with a newly acquired knowledge position, support the transition from training analyst to analyst. Here, Lacan returns to questions not only about knowledge and its transmission, but also to how a space for knowledge might be constituted. The pass is an exercise in the faculty of judgment, of witnessing how the subject engages in a shift regarding their knowledge position as well as its effects. We could even say that the idea of the contemporary pass recommends its importance to ethics, political philosophy, and even to the law through its judgment being based not on suitability, but on unsuitability. The question of governance is not what one stands in the name of, but how one struggles with something when they lose their footing in the name of what they say. And here we can say that the master's discourse, unsurprisingly, has little sympathy with what desire of the other has to say. The procedure of the pass in the psychoanalytic institution does not allow for a space in which those moments and revelations lie beyond language can necessarily transpire. This is because psychoanalysis presents as an in-between the speaking subject, the agent in Lacan's four discourses, and language which allows a confrontation with all knowledge. The function of psychoanalysis is to translate desire in the language the subject speaks. Freud's pamphlet on lay analysis lies firmly within the spirit of psychoanalysis. It is curious about how the unconscious produces symptoms which cause anguish for the analysand, and it directly circumvents the master's discourse imposing such a question. In critiquing his experiment of the pass, Lacan reinvigorates the status of curiosity as the kernel, that is the desire of psychoanalysis. What makes one tick? What does one get off on? The question and location of truth is straightforward for psychoanalysis. It is the unconscious truth which we are so curious about. The pass in this logic seems lackluster, even in demonstrating that one might embody something of the analyst. At this point, we might say that the pass is simply a fantasy of the psychoanalytic institution. Being regulated and authorized by the master's discourse, its call for the master is proposed and thus answered. But who or what should take up such a call? There are those institutional fields which govern one's well-being, psychology, mental health, and so on, and transmission of how one enters the field of such symbolic discourses bodes well. But what happens when one field of knowledge enters into another? For example, those of philosophy and psychoanalysis. To take a step back briefly, this kind of question of compatibility has been contemplated before when Lacan deliberated at length in his écrit on the question of whether psychoanalysis is a science. He approached this question because he was vehemently against psychoanalysis being named a religion, but ended up concluding that perhaps it wasn't a science, but perhaps could produce a science, because not just anyone could be the subject of true science. Moreover, he wanted to shed light on the knowledge of science as distinctive from psychoanalysis. Similarly, and although the philosophical psychoanalytic nexus is also fraught, these thinking fields share an intense desire to know, but for different reasons. How they both approach via language what is supposedly known with the logic, together with the logic they employ, sometimes coincide. For example, in order to understand Freud's missing the mark with Dora, Lacan employs Hegel's formalization of the dialectic. And in order to understand one's interpolation into language, he uses Cartesian logic. Using Descartes, Lacan asks, according to which discipline will I distinguish between what determines me and what I seek to possess? It is no secret that Freud respected classical anthropology, and his writings abound with references to Shakespeare, sources which in turn had taken what they could from elsewhere in order to sate their desire for knowledge of the unconscious. Through the interface of philosophy with psychoanalysis, the subject has the opportunity to take up a different position via curiosity. And this opportunity is a question of desire, in which through the schema of an institution, one can name themselves or be named. A close Australian analyst friend of mine once confessed that she did not feel adequate or properly inaugurated as an analyst, as the pass was not offered at her school. Thus, she sought out the pass and underwent the procedure abroad. Afterwards, she told me that it signified something for her, that she felt validated. Here in New Zealand, most of us are critical of the procedure of the pass. Nevertheless, in many psychoanalytic schools, the pass is a part of the institutional framework, demonstrating the legitimacy of being able to call oneself a psychoanalyst. But given the master's discourse of such a procedure, it pays to ask if this signifies knowing how to bear the paradox of the irreducible real, inevitable as an effect of analysis. Or is it rather that the pass is more an ambivalent political position implied in the logic of the institution of psychoanalysis? Moreover, does the procedure of the pass bestow the right to be named properly? Here it is important to understand that the pass of the 1967 proposition is today different. In 1967, the analyst was thought to be produced in the moment of analysis, and this moment had nothing to do with linear time. That is the termination of analysis. So the pass had the function of an injunction to speak about this moment, this turning point. Today, the pass is more about naming. What is implied by the name counts for savoir. The function of psychoanalysis is for subjective transformation to be supported by a transferential love, which is ongoing. The analyst, the subject supposed to know, is the foundation for this support, ensuring that for the analysand, unconscious logic is put to work, producing symptoms and repetitions, not all decipherable. What language does allow is that which is resistant to meaning, for jouissance to be a singular experience in which to discover how to handle the real. In this way, psychoanalysis necessarily exists beyond the institution. Freud's method of free association, which has not changed in 130 years, transcends the status of the institution and remains the distinctive mark of psychoanalysis. Regardless of one's qualification, the uptake of psychoanalysis is for many a life project. Following the termination of analysis, life goes on. Symptoms continue, jouissance gets handled hopefully a bit better. One goes on living with lack and loss, allowing impasses to exist with a bit less wrath of the law. Any claim of superiority regarding knowledge because of the past only serves as a distraction to the work of analysis and moreover curiosity. Certainly the work of psychoanalysis exists within an institution, yet it is best served on the premise of retaining the social bond, but without a master. This is because psychoanalysis is not so much a canon as a method which harbors sets of reference points, desire, drive, dreams, symptoms, repetition, and so on, all of which are inscribed into the symbolic order, but not reducible to it. Of course, the psychoanalyst exists in the same social bond as everybody else, but is, however, through the analyst's discourse, able to offer a clear conceptual account of the subject in the field of jouissance. The experience of analysis produces effects on both the transference and in everyday life. Paradoxically, this is what makes the task of carrying out one's work in an institution bearable, knowing that one can exist beyond such borders. The analyst must take on the role of ignorant and curious subject supposed to know, listen carefully, and communicate what is being missed in order to arouse desire in the analysand to make a demand. The function of the analyst is to say something else to the analysand, which arguably should remain enigmatic and invite associations until the analysand lets the real simply be and accepts castration. All this does not require the pass in allowing the analysand to move beyond of what can be said within the limitation of discourse. By contrast, the institutional constraint of the pass affects one's curiosity to listen to the impossible demand. Psychoanalysis attends to the psychic dimensions of such questions as what is a good life, rather than engaging with the impossibility of choices. Further, it does not produce an order of things or guarantee a structure, and it should not. Rather, it allows the subject to face up to inevitable contingency when compelled to say something, which when elicited, at the same time feels against one's will. Thus, psychoanalysis and philosophy are different discourses and should remain enigmatic objects to each other, their non-rapport being tethered by the jouissance of language. They are partners in symptoms, but little else. The past is a fantasy of the institution because in the context of today's psychoanalytic procedure, it simply doesn't fulfill any function. The past is an arrangement which seems to be non-reversible, non-reciprocal, hardly mutual, and entails an ontological priority. For the philosopher, however, the journey seems a little different, and being more institutionally bound presupposes an institutional link between subjects within a different discourse. Furthermore, it allows and encourages one to take up a position regardless. So psychoanalysis and philosophy arguably also experience the limitation of the linguistic term distinctively. In psychoanalysis, a demand has already taken place, the impossible already dealt with, the act of transferential love already suffered, the symptoms already spoken, the limits of inhabiting language already recognized. The evidence is already there, and the subject has already articulated it. When analysis ends, a different desire is reached from a different relationship with truth, one which is not the master's discourse at an interminable impasse. Because psychoanalysis is in this way extraterritorial and extra-linguistic, it does not make sense for the pass as an institutional mechanism to seek to gain territory. This is why I propose that perhaps the pass as a slip in the psychoanalytic discourse, that it reveals the truth of the institution, is best suited to philosophy, more specifically, the philosopher of psychoanalysis, rather than psychoanalysis. The procedure of the past provides testimony that there has been a change at the level of a desire for knowledge. Therefore, as a procedure of verification, the past is effective politically and ontologically. Moreover, the procedure of the past being institutional in nature, form, and structure, therefore wholly aligns with the master's discourse and most certainly the university discourse. Because philosophy has the dedication to elucidate an idea, perhaps it might be interesting to how curiosity regarding such dedication is enunciated beyond its signification. Lacan is clear when he stated that the procedure of the past is not some ineffable mystical undertaking. Rather, it is a pragmatic institutional principle which recognizes membership. It is a direct call to the institution. Thus, it makes perfect sense for psychoanalysis to hand over the pass so that the philosopher takes up the passage to be judged by their peers in the name of what constitutes true philosophy for the philosopher of psychoanalysis. Thank you very much.